So we're going to actually dig a little deeper into some of the commandments. And this morning we're going to look at the sixth commandment, depending on how you arrange them. But thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not murder. I remember in an interview quite a few years ago, they were interviewing Ruth Graham, and she was talking about all the turmoil in her marriage. And the interviewer said, "Did you ever consider divorce?" And she thought for a minute. She says, "No. Never considered divorce, murder a few times, but never divorce." And, honestly, this commandment really puzzles me. I mean, is it obvious? I mean, do you have to really say that? I mean, don't poke people in the eye with a stick, maybe, but don't murder them? Doesn't everybody just know that? I can think of other things that seem way more important, like don't run out of coffee. But I want to talk about what I think this command or this, what were we calling them? Not commands, but principles for living. Yeah, what this is about. What is it that God's actually talking about here? And, if you Google this, I Googled it. I got over 8 million responses to thou shalt not kill. So there's obviously a lot of different opinions about what this particular commandment means. So I'm going to express my opinion. Originally it was translated in the very first King James, thou shalt not kill, and then later translations switched it to thou shalt not murder. In order to talk about what I think this means, I want to talk to you about two Hebrew phrases, and apologize for my pronunciation. It's been a long time since I took Hebrew. But the first one is laleho, and then the second one is lalesua. So, first of all, laleho. Everything in creation is involved in a cycle. Everything that's living in creation is involved in a cycle. And the cycle is that you're born, you grow, you mature, you might procreate, and then you die. And that's basically the cycle that every living thing on the planet is involved in. And it's something that every one of us is involved in. Now, let me explain one of these cycles to you. Suppose Nancy goes out and she tills in her garden and she plants some little carrot seeds. And after 21 days, these little tiny leaves sprout up. And those carrots in their normal cycle would grow all summer long, and they would look sort of like this. And they would have this nice little green top on them. And then in the fall, they might shoot up a flower stalk, or they may wait till the next spring to shoot up a flower stalk. But after the flower stalk shoots up, little seeds come out of the flower stalks. They fall on the ground. The carrot rots and fertilizes the seeds. And that's the cycle. That's not what's going to happen in Nancy's garden, because somewhere in the middle of the summer, Nancy's going to come out there and she's going to look at this carrot. She says, "Yeah, that looks good." She's going to pull it up. She's going to take it in the house, wash it, and slice it into a salad. When she does that, that is laleho. She is interrupting the cycle of this plant, of this carrot. And that is a perfectly normal cycle of life, and God has arranged it so every living thing depends on some other living thing to live. And in order for you to live, you have to interrupt the cycle of other living things. Whether it's a carrot, whether it's a rabbit, whether it's a chicken, squirrel, whatever it is that you decide to consume, laleho is the process of interrupting that cycle of life so that your cycle of life can continue. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's not an act of violence. It's an act of creation. And it's part of creation, and it's something that God gives every human the right to be a part of. The only prohibition in this is that you can't interrupt the life of other humans to prolong your life. And other animals can't interrupt your life to prolong their life. But other than that, there's every plant, every animal is available to us. Now, there are some, God does make it very clear that there are certain things that you'd be better off not consuming. And I know from experience there are some things that are better not consuming. There are some people that become vegetarians because they think that it's wrong to kill animals. And in essence, what God says is that every life is precious, whether it's a carrot or a rabbit or a human, but that the continuation of life involves leleho, interrupting the cycle of other living things. Now, there's another aspect of leleho that's important, and that is that if something, for example, you're in the woods and there's a crazy bear that comes out of the woods and is charging for your children, leleho says that you have the right to interrupt that cycle of life to save life. And, you know, whether you use pepper spray or maybe it has to even be a fatal interruption, you have the right, in fact, not only the right, you have the responsibility to interrupt that cycle of life to protect human cycles of life. And that extends to other humans. So if someone breaks into your house and they're threatening to kill your loved ones, leleho says that you are perfectly within your rights to interrupt that cycle of life to protect the cycles of life that you're in charge of. And even to the extreme of that ending that life. And that's where capital punishment falls into as well, by the way. It also takes into consideration as a nation going to war against other nations that are acting ungodly, they're acting evil, they're acting in oppression in such a way that they are in themselves interrupting the cycle of other people's lives, killing people. So that's how we explain the United States going to war against Japan and against Germany, because those nations were involved in the illegal, the ungodly interruption of cycles of life of other people. And so there's lots of scriptures that talk about this, how leleho is there for nations to stand and be God's sense of judgment and God's sense of control on those people that are interrupting other people's cycles of life. Now, and that's not to say that all wars are justified. As people have said, probably the vast majority of wars are political or have to do with money, not to do with human life. And so that's something that we need to pray diligently for our leaders, that they understand that they're going into any type of a conflict, or they're engaged in any type of work, that they are doing it with, you know, godly principles, that they have met the parameters of leleho. It's very clear there. Genesis chapter 20, where it talks about command number 6, it is not talking about leleho. Okay, it's talking about something different, which is lesua. Lesua is most often interpreted as murder, but it's complicated because that particular Hebrew phrase is used much more widely than just murder. So there are people, in fact, if you go online and you can find people coming up with all kinds of very dogmatic positions about how to interpret these two different phrases, but they're not always careful because they pick and choose the ones that they want, you know, to support their particular views. But as I've studied lesua, it seems to me that what God is saying there is something more than just do not murder. And here's my take on it. The children of Israel had just come from hundreds of years from living in a suppressive culture of slavery, of abuse. They were in a situation where the Egyptians could basically do anything they wanted to them. The similarities between them and our history's nation of slavery is virtually identical. So they were coming out of that situation, and when they came out, they're not a violent, warlike people. These are people who have lived in slavery their whole life. They don't know aggression. But so I'm asking, so what? Why is this a point? Why is this a response that God wants to make to them? The reason is because I think that what Lechehu is actually talking about isn't just murder, it's talking about violence. And our natural response, anytime we are in a situation of oppression or anytime we see something which someone else is to want to respond to that. When I first heard that someone broke into our shed with huge crowbars, I started thinking about what I could do with a crowbar to their vehicle or whatever. I mean, that's just sort of your natural response. Years ago, my wife was involved in a road rage thing, and she came and told me about it, and I wanted to find that person and not just tell them the gospel. So that's just our natural reaction to when we're hurt, when we're oppressed, we naturally respond. We want to push back. We want other people to pay for what we are feeling. And I think what Yeshua says is, they need to guard your heart not to be a person of violence. Now, Leleho says that there are times when we have to be called to violence. And we'll see in the history of Israel that there will be times when God will bring them to nations that are resisting him, that are ungodly, they are cruel, they're full of incredible inhumanity, and Leleho will stop them. But in the midst of this is Leleshua, and that is resist violence. Resist violence. One of the most amazing things that we have seen throughout history is when people have made change, incredible change through nonviolent protests. I mean, if you look at the protests of South Africa, apartheid, if you think of the women's suffrage movement, if you think of the initial confrontation to slavery, ultimately it did end up in violence. But the initial pushback against that was all nonviolent legislative things that were taking place, especially in England. And then our own civil rights movement. I mean, there was no question that they, in a sense, would have been justified to rise up as a black nation and just go to war against all white people. But what they did that was so incredibly effective was nonviolence. Rosa Parks sitting in the seat of a bus. Those people standing and choosing to be abused and not responding in violence. And it would have been perfectly natural for the Israelites, having come out of a very abusive situation, to come out with a chip on their shoulder and just feel like, man, the world's been rough. I'm going to respond back to the world in anger and violence. I don't care. You treat me like the way they did. I'm coming back at you. So I think Leleshua says to us, we need to generate hearts of peace. Some weeks ago, I talked to you about our words and how a lot of our vocabulary just has its roots in violence. And that's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in my own life, about my word usage and being careful about the words I use. And I'm not offended by people using certain words. I don't really care if you want to use vulgarity or whatever. But I think most vulgarity has its roots in violence. And so in a movement away from being people of violence, I think that's one area that we can be very careful. Another thing I think is in how we view the planet and how we care about things on this planet. Do we really care that there's an island the size of Texas of plastic and floating in our oceans? Are we concerned about that? I think it's in the way that we address Leleho when it comes to those things that we eat. I mean, we certainly have a right to eat basically anything on the planet, but are we being considerate? Are we being thoughtful about the sacrifice that those animals, that creation is making to keep us alive? And one of the best movies, two movies that I loved. One is Buck, who learned to train horses nonviolently. And the whole history of horse working has been breaking horses, break their spirit. And Buck came along and said, you know what? I think you can do that without violence. And he started training people on how to non-violently train horses. And then Temple, what's her name? Grandin, and her work with animals, and incredible stories about how she's just she hadn't a problem with eating beef, but she just recoiled the violence that was associated with the processing of it. And so she's still working with that, is my knowledge. Someone locally is Lillian. You know Lillian, one of the things that she works in training dogs, and she is working on ways to train dogs non-violently. And so maybe they're just little things, maybe they're things that don't relate to you, but I think Yeshua says in every area of your life, work to be a person of peace. When you come into confrontation, when you think about your lifestyle, when you think about how you're viewing the food that you eat, when you think about your relationships with humans, with creation, with animals, be a person who is a person of peace, not a person of violence. There's an interesting verse in Genesis, if I could move my carrot aside here, that says, "And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting for every animal." Isn't that interesting? Not just every human, but for every animal. And maybe I'm reading too much, but what I think God is saying, there's some sacrifice there. It may not seem like much to you, but there is. One of my favorite movies is Last of the Mohicans, when they kill the elk and they pause for a minute and they thank the elk for giving its life for them. They knew they needed to do it. They had to have the food, but there was a sacrifice there. I think that is moving away from violence and becoming people who are consumed with the peace of God. I want to just leave you with one last verse. It's from Isaiah chapter 60. So I'm just going to make this our benediction. So if you want to just stand with me. Isaiah 60, verse 18, I think, is a great verse for us for a benediction. God, I just ask that this be in our hearts. No longer will violence be heard in your land, nor ruin, nor destruction within your borders, but you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. Amen.